Hello, I am Professor Eric Martin here at Lewis Clark State College, and in today's video I want to get us all set up for our discussion on Chapter 23 in Worlds of History, which is dealing with Westernization and nationalism in Japan and India in particular. And before we get into that, or maybe as a way of setting that up, I just want to remind us at the conceptual level about what we've been doing since the last exam. So in Chapter 20, this whole part of the ideas of the Enlightenment, we looked and got a sense about what the Enlightenment was, who was involved, how global it was, how Western it was, and the historical skill we really worked on in that particular section was focusing on closely reading documents that are written with a larger vocabulary, that are written with some reference to contemporary issues at the time, so that we as historians here in the 21st century can try to figure those out. So often having a sense of the historical context under which the document was written really helps us to get a sense about what the document means. I strongly encourage that with this week's documents. Look up the authors. Look up the situations they were involved in. If you can look up to see why they wrote a particular document, that will be tremendously helpful to you. Know your authors. Know your authors. Also, I want you to keep in mind that as far as the Enlightenment is concerned, it is during this period that the whole idea of national self-determination develops in the first place. And that's going to show itself up again in the readings for this week in Chapter 23, National Self-Determination. Make sure you know what it means. Okay, Chapter 21. We discuss the intertwined processes of industrialization and capitalism. And so on the one hand, historically, we're trying to figure out what is industrialization, what is capitalism, how are they related, how are they different, and really the historical skill that we worked on is how do you develop a history of two things that are so interwoven, okay? And that's going to come up again in this week's readings. Chapter 22, the stuff we did last week. That was the material on the new imperialism. And keep in mind, what made the new imperialism new was what? It was industrialization. And it was an extension of capitalism. So make sure that you have this whole idea about how to identify different kinds of processes in mind, and at least kind of keep them straight in your heads. The other thing that we did with those particular sources was that we looked at fiction as a historical source and kind of evaluated what we thought about using fictional materials as a historical source, or literature as historical sources. All right, this week the issue is Westernization and nationalism. First thing you need to do is make sure you know what those two terms mean, right? Westernization and nationalism. And we are examining the process of Westernization. All right, what is it? How many of these other processes that we've already talked about are involved in it? Examining the process of Westernization, and also looking at some of the contradictions it creates, particularly for colonized people in the process of trying to generate an identity. All right, colonial identity formation. The Bridging World's History video is specifically called Colonial Identities, and it really focuses on issues of clothing. Do you choose to wear Western clothing, or do you choose to wear Indian clothing, right? What kind of clothing do you choose to wear as being symbolic of your your level of westernization. So keep that stuff in mind, because there's a whole outward appearance that's also important for us trying to figure out how people identify themselves as. But then when we get into this week's documents in the Worlds of History book, we're specifically focusing on the relationship between Japan and the West and India and the West. Now, we could have picked a few different places, but these are the places we chose. So Japan and the West and India and the West. And what you want to do with this is to think a little bit about why some individuals from the same place adopt a more Western perspective and why others reject a more Western perspective. And then also how you might see adoption and rejection in the same person, right? Because, as humans, we're not always consistent. We have contradictions in us. And so we're going to learn to kind of look for these contradictions. And then on the one hand, you can say, oh, so-and-so is a hypocrite because they said this, but then they did that. And it's like, well, maybe. But that's also kind of what humans do sometimes, right? Is that our ideas sometimes are at odds with one another. Why is that? That's the mission for this week. So the sources you're going to be reading, you're going to be reading a secondary source from the historian Theodor von Lau called The Revolution of Westernization, or at least that's where it's from. And what I want you to do is to pay careful attention to that secondary source in terms of what he says happens to anti-Western individuals. What he says happens to the nationalist leaders in the colonies. What he says happens to the anti-colonial leaders in the colonies. What he says is their relationship with Western ideas. Now, I want you to also keep Theodor von Lau's thesis in mind as exactly that, a thesis. In the sense of, do you think the document's supported or not? You don't have to, so be ready to say, oh, okay, here's what he says happens, and then look in the documents, then you can decide whether or not you think that is what happens. Okay, that's the first piece you need to read. Make sure you understand what that is. Make sure you understand what Westernization is, all right? Make sure you understand what nationalism is. The next piece, or the next three pieces anyway, all deal with Japan. And so you want to think about the Japanese relationship to the West in the 19th century. And in these particular cases, on the one hand, you have these images of Japan. Those are interesting to check out. Take a look at them, get a sense about what you think it means in terms of the relationship. But really what we're looking at is the Fukuzawa Yukichi piece and the Kakuzo Ukakura piece. And the question for those two pieces, are they pro-Western or anti-Western? Do they think there should be a closer relationship between Japan and the West? Or do they think that there should be a more distant relationship between Japan and the West? Or is it more complicated than that? What are their main points? Why do they believe this anti-Western position or this pro-Western position? Why do you think the contradictions have generated themselves in this idea? And again, read Traditions and Encounters. Read the part specifically on the Western relationship with Japan. The Japanese take a very specific approach to attempt to dealing with the new imperialism of the 19th century. It will be very important for you to understand what that approach is. All right, next set of documents. These documents come from Ramamohan Roy, Mohandas Gandhi, and Nehru. And these are pretty interesting pieces. They're all They're all very interesting leaders in the Indian nationalist movement. And so the questions are exactly the same for all three of them. Okay, all three as for the Japanese ones. Are they pro-Western? Are they anti-Western? Is it more complicated than that? What are their main points? Where do you see the contradictions? And here's another thing to keep in mind as you do the reading. There is a special relationship between Gandhi and Nehru. What is it? What is their relationship? And then you might also think about, all right, so now I've kind of sorted out their ideas about their relationship to the West. Now, what's their relationship to each other, and what does all this mean? Again, traditions and encounters. Read the stuff on India. Look up Gandhi. Look up Nehru in the index. It'll take you right to the right material. Okay, that's what I got for you this week. So do the readings. Focus in on this whole process of westernization. Keep in the back of your head, what does it have to do with the 21st century? That's probably a good question for us to think about. Anyway, get your discussion posts up, do your readings, learn your material, enjoy your historical studies. As usual, you need to talk to me about the class, call me at the office, send me an email through Blackboard. Drop by the office during my office hours, and the next video that I put out, well, we've got a test. We've got an exam coming up, right? So we'll do something along those lines in terms of helping to get us ready for it. Okay, take care.